It all began in the glossy, glass-walled tower of an international conglomerate that dominated the skyline of the city. Everyone in that office walked with a certain rhythm, heels clicking against marble floors, suits swishing like whispers of ambition, voices lowered but urgent. At the top of that tower sat a man whose ego matched the height of the building. Mr. Harrison Caldwell, the CEO, prided himself on control, prestige, and above all, the image he projected to the world. He was a man who believed that status was everything and that money gave him the right to judge others without hesitation. Down in the service wing of that very tower, another story quietly unfolded. Her name was Amara. She worked as a cleaner, one of those invisible people who kept the world of the powerful running while being treated as though they were shadows in the corner. Amara was diligent, graceful in her movements, and often silent, not because she lacked words, but because she understood the dangerous assumptions people made once she opened her mouth. She carried herself with quiet dignity, even when she was forced to scrub coffee stains from the marble floors left behind by careless executives. Caldwell noticed her one morning. She had been wiping down the glass table in the boardroom, humming faintly under her breath, lost in her own world. He sneered when he saw her, his tailored suit contrasting against her plain uniform. To him, she was not a person but an object, a piece of background scenery. And when his board members chuckled about how even the help should look presentable, he took it upon himself to make a scene. "Hey you!" he barked, his voice slicing through the room. Amara froze, cloth still in hand. "If you're going to be in here, at least do it properly. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for me to host international clients while you parade around like this?" His words dripped with disdain. The executives laughed, some uncomfortably, others in open agreement, and Amara lowered her eyes. She said nothing, because she knew that defending herself in that moment would do nothing but fuel their mockery. Instead, she quietly finished her task, her fingers moving with the same precision as before, though her heart burned with a mixture of shame and anger. Caldwell wasn't finished. "Honestly," he continued, adjusting his cufflinks dramatically, "people like you should be grateful for the scraps of opportunity handed to you. Do your job and stay out of sight. That's all anyone asks." His tone carried the kind of arrogance that comes from years of unchecked authority. It should have ended there, just another day in which someone with power stepped on someone without it. But fate has a curious way of weaving threads together, setting the stage for revelations no one sees coming. Later that same afternoon, news swept through the office that an important investor was arriving from overseas. Not just any investor, but a Chinese millionaire named Li Wei, whose reputation was one of brilliance, discipline, and unshakable influence. Caldwell had been working for months to secure his partnership, and today was the day that deal might finally materialize. The office buzzed with anticipation, assistants scrambling to prepare, executives rehearsing pitches in hushed corners. Amara, as usual, continued her work in silence. She carried a small bucket of supplies, heading toward the executive lounge. When she entered, the room was empty for a moment. She exhaled, thankful for the rare silence, and began wiping down the leather chairs. Then the door swung open. Li Wei stepped in, his presence calm yet commanding, dressed in a simple but immaculately tailored suit. He was followed by Caldwell, who immediately launched into a stream of enthusiastic greetings. Amara instinctively moved to the side, trying to make herself invisible. But in her haste, her cloth slipped from her hand and landed near Li Wei's shoes. She bent quickly to retrieve it, whispering in flawless Mandarin, "I'm sorry. Please excuse me." The sound of her voice halted the air in the room. Li Wei blinked, his expression shifting from polite neutrality to genuine surprise. "You speak Mandarin?" he asked, his tone warm but incredulous. Amara straightened slowly, eyes flickering with hesitation. But she nodded. "Yes," she answered in Mandarin again, her pronunciation sharp and effortless. Caldwell laughed harshly. "Oh, don't be fooled. She's just the maid. Probably picked up a few phrases from a YouTube video." He waved dismissively, as though swatting away an inconvenient fly. But Li Wei did not laugh. Instead, he leaned forward, curiosity sparking in his gaze. He asked Amara a question. Something complex, something layered with cultural nuance that no amateur could possibly fake. Without missing a beat, Amara responded, her tone respectful, her grammar precise. The silence that followed was electric. Caldwell's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He glanced between Li Wei and Amara, suddenly uncertain of the dynamic unfolding before him. Li Wei smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that revealed both amusement and admiration. Impressive, he said in English now, turning to Caldwell. Very impressive. Tell me, why is someone with such skill cleaning your floors? Caldwell opened his mouth, but no words came. The ground beneath his carefully curated image had begun to shift, though he didn't yet understand how devastating the cracks in that image would soon become. Caldwell forced a chuckle, as if trying to downplay the sudden twist in the air. Well, Mr. Lee, he stammered. You know how it is. Some people just happen to have unusual hobbies. I suppose she got lucky enough to pick up a little here and there. But Li Wei's eyes did not leave Amara. There was a sharpness in his gaze now, the kind of attention reserved only for someone who had revealed something extraordinary. He shifted from English back to Mandarin, asking her where she had learned to speak with such accuracy, which dialect she had studied, and how she maintained such fluency. Amara hesitated at first. She was not accustomed to being the center of attention, especially not in a room where power and wealth pressed down on her like invisible weight. Yet there was something respectful, almost kind, in Li Wei's tone. So she answered. She told him she had studied Mandarin for years, not in a classroom but through immersion, living in a small Chinese community abroad for a time, working side by side with people who taught her not just words but culture, proverbs, and unspoken customs. The executives who had gathered to witness Caldwell's grand pitch were now staring wide-eyed, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The maid they had laughed at mere hours ago was conversing effortlessly with one of the most influential men in Asia, exchanging not just words but the kind of subtle references that mark true cultural understanding. Caldwell's jaw tightened. This was supposed to be his stage, his moment to shine. Instead, the spotlight had swung sharply onto someone he considered beneath him. He cleared his throat loudly, attempting to redirect the conversation. Shall we, Mr. Lee? The presentation is ready. I think you'll be quite impressed with our strategy for expansion. Li Wei did not immediately respond. He continued his exchange with Amara, asking her thoughts on cultural misinterpretations in business, on how small gestures could mean everything in negotiations. She replied thoughtfully, offering examples she had witnessed firsthand. Each word only deepened the impression she left. Finally, Li Wei turned to Caldwell, his tone even but edged with quiet authority. I am impressed, he said, but not with a presentation I haven't yet seen. I'm impressed that someone you treat as invisible has more depth and awareness than many executives I've met in boardrooms across the world. The room froze. The power dynamic had flipped like a switch. Caldwell laughed nervously, sweat prickling at the back of his neck. Ah, yes, well, she's full of surprises, I suppose. You know how it is. But Li Wei was not smiling anymore. He studied Caldwell with a measured expression, as if reassessing everything he thought he knew about the man. Tell me, he asked quietly, how do you usually treat the people who work for you? It was an innocent-sounding question, yet weighted with judgment. Caldwell's carefully polished facade cracked for a second. Of course I treat them fairly. Everyone has their place, you know? We all have roles to play. Amara felt the heat of his words, the subtle sting meant to remind her of her place. But she held her head higher now, not in defiance, but in dignity. For once, the shame he tried to project onto her no longer clung so tightly. Li Wei nodded slowly, as though filing away a piece of evidence. Then he turned to Amara one final time. In Mandarin, he said softly, You have more value than they realize. Don't let their blindness make you forget your worth. Amara blinked, startled by the kindness. She bowed her head slightly, whispering her thanks. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. Caldwell's presentation felt forced, his voice cracking as he stumbled over numbers and graphs. The executives, usually quick to applaud his every word, seemed distracted, their eyes flicking now and then toward Amara, as if they were seeing her for the first time. And Li Wei? He listened politely but without the same enthusiasm he had shown before. Occasionally he jotted notes, his expression unreadable. When the presentation ended, the room fell into a heavy silence, awaiting his verdict. Li Wei stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. "Your proposal has merit," he admitted. "But business is more than numbers. It's about trust, respect, and the way you treat people when no one is watching. That tells me far more than any chart." Caldwell's throat went dry. He nodded rapidly, desperate to salvage the moment. Of course, we pride ourselves on values like that." But the words rang hollow, bouncing against the walls of the boardroom like empty echoes. Li Wei's gaze lingered on Amara once more, and then he left the room, leaving behind an atmosphere so thick with tension it was almost suffocating. When the doors closed, Caldwell spun on Amara. His face was red, his composure shattered. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he hissed. "Do you realize you just undermined me in front of my most important client?" Amara stared at him, her hands tightening around the cloth she still carried. She wanted to explain that she hadn't sought his attention, that she had only apologized out of courtesy, that everything that followed was beyond her control. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Caldwell wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for someone to blame. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice low but venomous. "I won't have some maid ruining years of my work." What he didn't realize was that the seeds of his downfall had already been planted. The humiliation he had inflicted on her had not just exposed his arrogance. It had revealed the emptiness beneath his empire. And Amara, though she had never sought to challenge him, was now at the center of a storm that was only beginning to gather. That night, long after the office lights had dimmed and the city outside pulsed with neon and headlights, Amara walked home with a heaviness pressing on her chest. Her small apartment was tucked in the quieter side of town, far away from the polished skyscrapers where men like Caldwell paraded their power. Inside, it smelled faintly of lavender soap and warm rice. She placed her bucket of cleaning supplies in the corner and sat on the edge of her modest bed, letting the silence surround her. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend she hadn't spoken to in months. They asked how she was, and Amara stared at the screen for a long time before replying with something simple. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Not really. She couldn't shake the scene in the boardroom. The laughter, the humiliation, the weight of Caldwell's words pressing her down as though she were nothing. But equally, she couldn't shake the look in Li Wei's eyes, the way he had seen her, truly seen her, in a place where she was expected to remain invisible. That recognition had stirred something inside her she hadn't felt in years. The reminder that she was more than what people assumed. Meanwhile, in his penthouse suite, Caldwell paced like a caged animal. The city skyline stretched before him, glittering with wealth, yet he felt cornered. Li Wei's silence at the end of the meeting gnawed at him. He had expected firm praise, maybe even a handshake to seal the deal. Instead, he'd received ambiguity, doubt, and worst of all, that strange moment where his own maid had outshined him. He poured himself a drink, muttering curses under his breath. "No way," he growled. "No way some cleaning woman ruins this for me." He told himself he was still in control, that tomorrow he'd smooth it over, that Li Wei couldn't possibly take her seriously. But beneath his bravado lurked fear, the fear that his empire, built on arrogance and image, was starting to crack. The next morning, Amara arrived at work earlier than usual. She wanted to avoid attention, to slip quietly into her routine. Yet the moment she stepped into the lobby, she sensed the whispers. People stared, some with curiosity, others with resentment. Word had spread. The maid who spoke perfect Mandarin. The maid who had caught the eye of the Chinese millionaire. She kept her head down, pretending not to notice, but inside she felt the shift. The walls that once confined her invisibility were thinner now. People who used to ignore her suddenly wanted to place her under a microscope. Later that day, As she polished the glass railing on the mezzanine, an assistant approached timidly. "Excuse me," the young man said, glancing around nervously. "Did you really talk to Mr. Li in Chinese yesterday?" Amara looked up, cloth in hand, unsure whether to answer. But the assistant's eyes were wide with something like admiration, not mockery. She nodded once. "That's incredible," he whispered. I studied Mandarin for a year, and I still can't even order food without messing it up. How did you do it?" She gave a small smile, the first genuine one she'd felt in days. "Consistency," she said softly, "and listening more than speaking." The assistant grinned, as though she'd shared a secret treasure. "Wow, you're amazing." He scurried off, leaving Amara standing there, stunned by the unfamiliar warmth of respect. But Caldwell was watching from above, his eyes narrowed like a hawk. Every moment she spent gathering quiet admiration only deepened his resentment. He stormed into his office, slamming the door hard enough to make the glass tremble. By the afternoon, the inevitable confrontation arrived. He summoned her with a sharp call over the intercom. "Amara, my office. Now." She entered cautiously, heart thudding, hands folded tightly in front of her. Caldwell didn't bother with pleasantries. "Do you realize what you've done?" he spat. "You embarrassed me. You stole attention that wasn't yours to take. Do you understand the damage you've caused?" Her lips parted, but he cut her off with a sneer. "Don't even try to justify it. You think speaking a few fancy words makes you special? It doesn't. You're still just the maid. And I won't let you forget that." His words struck like daggers, but this time, something inside Amara refused to crumble. She lifted her chin, her voice quiet but steady. "I never tried to take anything from you, Mr. Caldwell. I only showed respect." The simplicity of her statement unsettled him more than if she had shouted. He leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Respect? If you respected me, you'd stay silent. That's the problem with people like you. You forget your place the moment someone gives you a scrap of attention." For a long moment, they stared at each other, power and dignity clashing silently in the air. Then Caldwell waved his hand dismissively. "Get out. And remember, if this costs me the deal, you'll be the one paying the price." Amara left his office with trembling hands, but not with the same shame as before. His threats no longer felt as heavy, because deep down, she realized something. The fear she once had of men like Caldwell was already starting to fade, and in that fading fear, a new strength was being born. 2 days later, a message landed in Caldwell's inbox with the weight of a gavel. Li Wei's team requested a follow-up visit, not just another slideshow, but a walkthrough of the company's operations and a private dinner with a handful of key people. The note included a detail that made Caldwell's stomach drop. "We would appreciate the presence of the employee who assisted Mr. Li in Mandarin." There it was in black and white. The maid he'd dismissed had become a requested attendee. He stared at the screen, pulse ticking in his temples. On another day, he might have spun it as a clever tactic. "We include all levels of staff to show inclusivity." But the memory of that boardroom crackled through his nerves. He jabbed the intercom. "HR. Now." Within minutes, an HR manager appeared, clutching a tablet. Caldwell didn't bother with pleasantries. "Reassign the cleaner, Amara, whatever her last name is, to night shifts, effective immediately, and flag her file for insubordination. She's become disruptive." The manager blinked. "Sir, Mr. Li specifically." Caldwell slammed his palm on the desk. "Do I run this company, or does Li Wei? Make it happen." But fate, again, refused to bend to his will. Before the manager could step out, Caldwell's phone rang. The caller ID, Li Wei. He steadied his voice and answered. "Mr. Li, we're thrilled about your follow-up. Everything's being prepared." "Good," Li Wei said, measured and cordial. "And the employee, Amara. Please ensure she's invited. I want her beside me for the tour. Consider it a sign of the culture here." Caldwell's jaw ached from the smile he forced. "Absolutely. We pride ourselves on inclusivity." When the line clicked off, he exhaled through his teeth. The HR manager hovered, unsure. Caldwell waved her away, sour defeat twisting his mouth. Fine. Put her on the invite list. Word trickled through the building like spilled ink. Some coworkers congratulated Amara in awkward half-whispers. Others rolled their eyes or clucked under their breath about lucky breaks and playing favorites. She absorbed it quietly. That evening, in her apartment, she ironed her uniform with meticulous care. She paused at her small shelf of books, language guides dog-eared and soft, a slim volume of classical Chinese poetry, a stack of notebooks filled with characters she'd copied hundreds of times. She tucked one notebook into her bag. Not for show, for steadiness. The day of the visit, the office performed its ritual of perfection. Polished floors, fruit trays aligned like mosaics, branded pens squared to 90-degree angles. As Li Wei arrived with 2 advisors, Caldwell spread his hands in welcome, voice pitched bright. We've got a full agenda. Operations tour, product demos, then dinner at the Riverside restaurant. You'll love the tasting menu. Excellent, Li Wei replied. His eyes landed on Amara, who stood slightly behind the group, not hidden, not center stage. Present. Shall we? In the production lab, an engineer delivered a technical spiel terse with acronyms. Li Wei's advisor leaned toward Amara and asked, in Mandarin, for clarification on a particular tolerance level. She translated not word for word, but meaning to meaning, bridging the gap with a small analogy about puzzle pieces fitting without friction. The advisor smiled, and the engineer, surprised, nodded. Yes, that's exactly it. Caldwell tried to steer attention back to himself. He bragged about innovation pipelines and synergy, waving toward a prototype with a name he'd coined, Vision 4. Amara's breath caught. She knew better than to interrupt, yet instinct tugged at her sleeve. Li Wei's gaze flicked to her, permission without words. She leaned in, speaking quietly to Caldwell but audible enough for the group. Sir, if the Chinese brand name mirrors the English, the number 4 might be read as inauspicious by some customers. It sounds similar to the word for death in several dialects. It's a minor point, but marketing might want to consider an alternate naming convention for that market. Perhaps Vision 8 or a localized name with a favorable character. Caldwell's smile calcified. We've sold thousands of units under that name domestically, he said, almost a growl. We're not superstitious. Li Wei didn't even blink. It isn't superstition. It's literacy in context. Thank you, he said to Amara, straightforward, as if acknowledging a colleague. One of his advisors scribbled a note with visible relief. They moved on. At the prototype bench, an intern fumbled with a demo device. Caldwell barked. The intern's hands trembled more. Amara crouched beside the table, found the misaligned connector, and clicked it into place with steady fingers. There, she said softly. It was just shy of flush. The device hummed to life. The intern mouthed, "Thank you," and looked like he might actually breathe again. By the time dinner rolled around, the air had shifted. Not dramatically, no confetti, no trumpet blasts. Just the quiet rebalancing that happens when competence shows up where it's least expected. At the restaurant, servers drifted like dancers. Caldwell had chosen the private room with floor-to-ceiling windows, the city river gliding past like black silk. He made a show of offering gifts, company-branded pens in a velvet box. Li Wei accepted politely. Amara noticed the way Caldwell extended them with one hand, card atop the box, his name printed in a vivid red ink. Her stomach pinched. She remembered long afternoons in a tea shop years ago, learning how certain gestures whisper meaning louder than words. She caught Caldwell's eye and murmured, "2 hands for the exchange. And the red, maybe avoid signing names in red next time. It can carry finality." He scoffed under his breath, but he used both hands for the next presentation. Li Wei's glance toward Amara held a glimmer of approval, almost an inside joke shared across a table crowded with porcelain and steam. Courses arrived. Delicate dumplings, crisp greens, fish that flaked with a sigh. Conversation turned to values. Caldwell trumpeted corporate social responsibility. It sounded like a brochure. Li Wei asked about on-the-ground stories, real ones. Caldwell fished for something tidy. He came up empty. Amara didn't speak until Li Wei's advisor asked, in Mandarin, what she'd noticed while working in the building that most executives never see. She hesitated, then offered a small, clear piece of truth. People notice when the last person in the room holds the door. They notice when a manager remembers a name. They notice who leaves their mess for someone else to clean. Respect shows up in crumbs and fingerprints. Silence settled, a respectful kind, not awkward. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but no one looked at him. They were looking at the idea, at the picture she'd painted so simply that it couldn't be argued with. As dessert arrived, Caldwell made his play. Mr. Li, a partnership between our firms would unlock efficiencies across the board. We can sign a memorandum this week if you're ready. Li Wei took a sip of tea. A thoughtful proposal deserves a thoughtful cadence, he said. I'll return tomorrow with a draft of my own. He stood, then turned to Amara. Thank you for your guidance today. When the party dispersed, Caldwell didn't bother pretending. In the shadowed corridor outside the private room, he rounded on her, voice low and sharp. You will not speak tomorrow unless spoken to. You will show up, stand where I tell you, and you will stop inserting yourself into matters far beyond your pay grade. Do you understand? Amara met his stare. Fear fluttered, yes, but it didn't sit on her shoulders the way it used to. I understand my job is to help our guests feel respected, she said calmly. That's what I did. Your job, he hissed, is whatever I say it is. He straightened his jacket, pasted on a smile for a couple exiting the room, then leaned in again, voice like ice. One more step out of line, and I won't just move you to nights. I'll make sure you don't work in this city again. He left her with that, a threat hanging like fog. She stood alone for a few beats, heartbeat steadying. Then she exhaled, pressed a palm lightly to her notebook through the fabric of her bag, and walked into the night where the river hissed softly against the banks. Back home, she opened the notebook to a page she'd once rewritten until her hand cramped. A proverb about how true character is revealed when no one is watching. She smiled barely, and wrote a single line beneath it. Tomorrow, I'll stand where the truth can see me. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet suite high above the lights, Li Wei loosened his tie and considered the day. How a company could be brilliant in numbers and falter in the small things that make trust. He drafted 3 questions for tomorrow's meeting, each one circling the same point. Not what they build, but how they treat the hands that build it. The following morning arrived heavy with anticipation. The building's air felt charged, as though every fluorescent bulb hummed a little louder. Every polished surface reflected not just light but nerves. Executives rehearsed buzzwords under their breath. Assistants triple-checked binders, and the catering team fussed with trays of fruit, as if the angle of a strawberry slice might sway an international deal. Amara, in her pressed uniform, walked through the lobby with a calm that surprised even herself. Whispers followed her like shadows, but she didn't quicken her step. She carried her notebook tucked under her arm, not as armor but as a quiet reminder that her knowledge, her discipline, and her dignity were hers to hold, untouchable by mockery. Upstairs, Caldwell prowled his office like a wolf with a thorn in its paw. He barked orders, snapped at his secretary, and checked his reflection in the window's glass. Today, he told himself he would reclaim control. Li Wei might have been charmed by the maid yesterday, but business was business. Money spoke louder than sentiment. He convinced himself of this lie until it tasted almost believable. When Li Wei arrived, he wasted no time. He greeted Caldwell with courtesy but without flourish, then turned to Amara with an ease that made her co-workers' jaws tighten. Good to see you again, he said in Mandarin, as though acknowledging a peer. She bowed her head politely, replying with the same fluency that had startled him the day before. They moved into the conference room. This time, the seating chart had been carefully arranged by Caldwell to ensure Amara sat at the far end, as though distance might mute her presence. Yet Li Wei casually adjusted the arrangement, inviting her to sit closer to his side. The subtle power play was not lost on anyone. Caldwell's smile tightened as though stretched over glass. The meeting opened with Li Wei's questions. They were not the predictable inquiries about profits and projections that Caldwell had spent months preparing for. Instead, they were deceptively simple questions about company culture, staff treatment, and long-term trust. "Tell me," he began, "what policies do you have to ensure every employee feels valued? From the highest executive to the person who cleans the floor?" Caldwell's tongue stumbled. He fumbled for phrases: inclusivity, team spirit, equal opportunity. But the hollowness of his words rang out like a cracked bell. His executives nodded in rehearsed unison, but none offered substance. Li Wei turned, almost gently, to Amara. "And you, what do you see?" The room froze. Every pair of eyes landed on her, some with disdain, some with quiet curiosity. Amara felt the weight of expectation pressing down, but she steadied her breath. She thought of the fingerprints on glass doors, the discarded coffee cups left for her to collect, the rare kindness of a thank you whispered in passing. She spoke slowly, clearly. "I see how respect is shown in the small things. Some people never look at me when I pass. Others greet me by name. Some leave messes without thought. Others pause to clean up after themselves. I don't think people realize how much character shows when no one important is watching." Her words, plain but piercing, sank into the room. Li Wei's eyes gleamed with approval. The executives shifted uncomfortably, as if mirrors had been held up before them. Caldwell coughed, desperate to wrestle back control. "Well, yes, of course, our culture values everyone. She's simply giving a personal perspective." But the damage was done. The imbalance in the room had tilted further. Hours stretched on, filled with discussions that Caldwell tried to dominate but which Li Wei continually redirected. Every time Amara spoke, it wasn't with the flourish of ambition, but with the quiet gravity of someone telling the truth. And every time, her words carried more weight than Caldwell's rehearsed slogans. By the close of the meeting, the verdict loomed. Li Wei rose, buttoning his jacket, and addressed the room. "Numbers matter, strategies matter, but trust matters more. I cannot invest where dignity is dismissed, no matter how impressive the spreadsheets look." His gaze slid to Caldwell like a blade. "Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your effort, but I must ask myself, if you treat those closest to you with disregard, how will you treat partners abroad?" Caldwell's chest constricted. His mouth opened, but nothing emerged. His empire of confidence felt like it was collapsing brick by brick. Then Li Wei turned to Amara. "You reminded me yesterday that respect lives in details. Today, you've shown me it's not just words, but action. People like you are the foundation of any company worth trusting." The room erupted in silence, so loud, it seemed deafening. When Li Wei departed, leaving a storm of whispers behind him, Caldwell exploded. Caldwell's fury boiled over as he slammed the conference room door shut, accusing Amara of humiliating him and declaring she was nothing without this job. But Amara, though shaken, refused to shrink. "I am not nothing," she said, her voice steady. "You just never looked close enough to see." Caldwell, consumed by pride, fired her on the spot. The next morning, whispers spread through the office. Amara was gone. Some pitied her, some smirked, but all remembered Li Wei's presence the day before and suspected this dismissal would not go unnoticed. Amara quietly gathered her belongings, just a canvas bag, a few personal items, and her notebooks filled with years of study. She walked out with dignity, even as injustice pressed heavy on her heart. Meanwhile, Caldwell received a call that shook him. Li Wei wanted a private meeting. In a serene tea house, Li Wei confronted him. Dismissing Amara, he said, was not a business decision but an act of weakness. Authority built on humiliation is not authority. It is weakness disguised as power. I do not invest in weakness. Caldwell pleaded for reconsideration, but Li Wei ended the meeting coldly. Caldwell's empire was already trembling. Amara, alone in her apartment, fought despair. But she remembered Li Wei's words, "Don't let their blindness make you forget your worth." Her phone buzzed. It was Li Wei himself asking to meet. Hours later, in that same tea house, he treated her with respect, offering not pity but opportunity. A role in his new consultancy bridging East and West. "Do not reduce yourself with just," he told her. "You are capable, and you've already proven it." Amara, stunned, agreed to consider. For the first time, she felt seen. Days later, she began work. Unlike Caldwell's company, Li Wei's office was grounded in humility and respect. Her training was immersive. Listening sessions, cultural case studies, real negotiations. Amara quickly proved invaluable. She noticed nuances others missed. Trust disguised as timelines, subtle missteps in branding, unspoken cultural cues. Clients responded with relief and respect. Her insight brought clarity, not condescension. While Amara thrived, Caldwell unraveled. The board probed complaints long ignored. Old notes mocking his cleaning staff resurfaced, painting him as cruel and detached. He tried spinning the story in the press, but journalists pressed for proof he couldn't provide. His swagger, once his shield, now looked hollow. Amara's days, in contrast, were filled with meaningful work. She suggested practical changes, like giving subject matter experts a voice regardless of rank, that transformed meetings. She brought dignity where hierarchy usually silenced. At a manufacturer roundtable, she asked a CEO, "Your product speaks for itself. But in what language?" That simple question unlocked a breakthrough partnership. Eventually, Amara faced Caldwell again. At a high-stakes multilateral meeting, Li Wei warned her, "Don't let him bait you. Give the room clarity." When Caldwell tried to belittle her, "I see we're letting the help take notes now," she calmly focused on the work, smoothing over translation issues and steering discussions to substance. The meeting flourished. Caldwell's attempts to dominate fell flat. Amara ended with a quiet ritual, asking each person to name something they had learned from another in the room. The atmosphere shifted from competition to collaboration. Outside the meeting, Caldwell cornered her, hissing that people like him don't lose. Amara, no longer intimidated, replied, "People like you already did. You just haven't noticed yet." She walked away, sunlight streaming like a promise she could finally believe in. Caldwell left furious, still wearing his mask for others, but inside he was collapsing. He barked orders, demanded dirt on Li Wei, raged at staff who no longer respected him, only feared him. His empire was cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. Amara, meanwhile, walked home with a calm steadiness. It wasn't triumph but clarity. She was no longer a shadow in someone else's story. In her notebook she wrote, "Power built on fear is already crumbling. Power built on dignity lasts." That night, Li Wei reflected too. "They chase profit with urgency," he said of Caldwell's firm, "but neglect the soil that keeps profit growing. A tree that ignores its roots falls in the first storm." His advisors agreed. The partnership with Caldwell's company was slipping away, while Amara's future had just begun. Yet Amara's role was only just beginning to expand. The next week, Li Wei invited her to join a series of cultural briefings with a group of Western executives preparing to enter the Chinese market. These were men and women with polished resumes and polished egos, used to controlling rooms with their voices. They were skeptical when Amara entered. One of them leaned to another and whispered, "Isn't she a cleaner or something?" The chuckle was sharp. But then Li Wei introduced her. "This is Amara," he said evenly. "She will guide you today. Listen carefully, because she will save you from mistakes you don't even know you're about to make." The executives raised brows, some amused, others annoyed. Amara didn't posture. She simply began. She explained how certain numbers carried cultural weight, how gift-giving wasn't bribery but symbolism, how silence in a meeting wasn't disinterest but often respect. She wove small stories, an anecdote about a tea ceremony she once attended, where the order of pouring said more than the words exchanged. An example of a contract negotiation that stalled for months because a Western firm failed to notice the insult hidden in their chosen logo. At first, the executives smirked, but as she continued, their smirks faded. Her voice carried no arrogance, only experience and clarity. When she finished, silence hung heavy. One finally said, How do you know all this?" She smiled faintly. Because I listened when no one else thought I was listening. The room absorbed her words. For the first time, they realized the value of someone they might have dismissed. Outside those walls, Caldwell's empire continued to unravel. Rumors spread. Employees were leaving in waves. Investors whispered about mismanagement. And Li Wei's quiet but firm withdrawal from the partnership sent shockwaves through the market. Caldwell raged, but rage couldn't stop the tide. And then came the moment he had feared most. The board called him in. The polished oak table that once felt like his throne now felt like a tribunal. They questioned him about staff treatment, about cultural missteps, about the disastrous fallout with Li Wei. Caldwell defended himself with bluster, but bluster was no longer enough. The board members exchanged glances, and in the quiet that followed, one of them spoke. "We built this company on your ambition, Caldwell. But ambition without wisdom becomes recklessness. We can't afford recklessness anymore." By the end of that meeting, his fate was sealed. The resignation they requested was thinly veiled termination. He left the building not as a conqueror, but as a man stripped of the very identity he had worshipped. Amara learned of it days later, not with glee, but with a strange ache. She knew his cruelty well, but she also understood that watching someone unravel was never as satisfying as people imagined. It left behind emptiness, a reminder that arrogance always carried the seeds of its own destruction. Her life, however, was beginning anew. Li Wei offered her more responsibility, drafting cultural playbooks, advising not just as a translator of language but of meaning. She traveled, first domestically, then abroad, walking into rooms she never would have dreamed of entering, not as the maid, but as Amara, strategist, guide, equal. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she walked through a park where lanterns glowed softly in the trees. Children laughed, vendors sold roasted chestnuts, and the air smelled of jasmine and smoke. She sat on a bench, notebook in hand, and wrote. "I used to think invisibility was safety, but it was just silence, and silence can be broken." She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. For the first time, the future felt not just possible, but hers. The news of Caldwell's downfall traveled faster than fire in dry grass. Former employees who had once been silent suddenly found their voices, sharing stories of mistreatment, disregard, and arrogance that painted a portrait far darker than the polished image he had sold to the world. Articles appeared in business journals, and whispers filled industry events. The mighty CEO brought down, not by competitors, but by his own blindness. Caldwell retreated from the spotlight, but his pride wouldn't let him vanish entirely. He paced his penthouse at night, plotting comebacks, drafting angry letters he never sent. To him, Amara was not just a maid who had embarrassed him. She was the symbol of his humiliation, the reminder that power had slipped from his hands. His anger twisted into obsession. If not for her, he told himself. But deep down, he knew it wasn't her. It was him. And that truth was unbearable. Amara, meanwhile, was walking into spaces that once felt like locked rooms. She sat at round tables with executives who now listened to her insights with respect, though some still carried a residue of skepticism. She didn't demand their trust. She earned it, slowly, with every careful observation, every subtle correction that spared them from stumbling into offense. At one meeting, a Western company was preparing to launch a new campaign in Beijing. Their slogan, translated directly, sounded noble in English, but in Mandarin, it landed clumsy, almost laughable. Amara gently explained the double meaning, offering an alternative phrase rooted in idiom. At first, they resisted. "It's catchy in English," one argued, but then she painted the picture. Imagine if someone tried to sell you dignity with a slogan that sounded like a schoolyard joke. Would you take them seriously? The room fell silent. They changed the campaign. Word of her skill spread. She wasn't just a consultant. She was becoming a bridge. And bridges, once trusted, are invaluable. One evening, after a long day, she received a message from Li Wei. It was simple, "Dinner tomorrow. I'd like to introduce you to someone important." The next night, she arrived at a quiet restaurant lit by lanterns, the scent of sesame and ginger in the air. Li Wei greeted her warmly, and at his side stood an older woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Her posture carried grace, her eyes sharp yet kind. "This is Madame Zhang," Li Wei explained, "an advisor to many governments, a scholar of culture and diplomacy. She has shaped the way nations speak to one another." Amara bowed respectfully. Madame Zhang studied her for a moment before smiling. "So, you are the one I've heard about, the maid who spoke perfect Mandarin." Her tone was not mocking but admiring, as though savoring the irony. Amara flushed slightly but nodded. "Yes, that was me." Madame Zhang leaned forward. "Good. Never be ashamed of where you began. It makes your story stronger, not weaker." She sipped her tea before continuing. "Li Wei tells me you have a rare gift. Not just language but listening. Do you know how rare that is in boardrooms?" Amara shook her head quietly. "It is rarer than gold," Madame Zhang said firmly. "Because people who listen can see the currents beneath the waves. They can guide ships safely through storms while others drown in noise." The words sank deep into Amara's heart. For years, she had been treated as if listening made her lesser, as if silence meant insignificance. Now it was being named as strength. Over the next weeks, Madame Zhang mentored her, offering lessons that went beyond words. She taught her the art of pause, the power of letting silence stretch until others revealed more than they intended. She explained how to read the tilt of a teacup, the flicker of an eyebrow, the rhythm of laughter at a table. "Every culture speaks with more than its tongue," she said. "Learn to hear it all." Amara absorbed it like rain on parched soil. Each lesson expanded her vision, sharpening her instincts. She found herself not just translating language, but translating people, bridging intent and perception with care. Meanwhile, Caldwell tried to claw back relevance. He appeared on small panels, railing against cancel culture and overreaction. But the rooms were smaller now, the applause thinner. Without power, his words sounded less like authority and more like complaint. The empire he once commanded had reduced to a fragile ego, desperately clinging to scraps. Amara didn't waste energy thinking of him. Her world was fuller now, work that mattered, mentors who believed in her, a future that stretched wide instead of closing in. One evening, she stood at her window, looking out at the city lights, and whispered to herself, "I was never invisible. They just refused to see." And this time she believed it. Months passed, and Amara's world grew larger in ways she could barely have imagined before. Her days were filled with strategy sessions, cultural analyses, and meetings that crossed borders without needing a plane. She was still humble, still the woman who once scrubbed marble floors, but she now carried herself with a quiet authority that made even seasoned executives pause and listen. One of her proudest moments came during a joint summit between several Western corporations and a coalition of Chinese entrepreneurs. The stakes were high, contracts worth billions waiting on trust that had yet to be earned. Amara wasn't scheduled to speak, only to advise from the side. But midway through the talks, a misunderstanding flared. A Western executive, trying to push urgency, compared the deal to striking while the iron is hot. In English, it was harmless. Translated directly into Mandarin, however, it carried undertones of recklessness, almost aggression. The room grew stiff. Amara leaned toward Li Wei, whispered her observation, and he gave her a nod. With measured calm, she raised her voice just enough to carry across the table. "Perhaps a better way to frame it," she suggested, "is to say that we should plant at the right season, so the harvest can come in full. It honors patience while acknowledging timeliness." The Chinese delegation relaxed instantly, their faces softening. The metaphor resonated, familiar, respectful, rooted in their own worldview. The Western team glanced at her in surprise, then relief. The tension dissolved. Negotiations continued smoothly. Afterward, one of the senior executives approached her, awe in his tone. "You saved us back there. I didn't even realize what I'd said could offend them." Amara only smiled faintly. That's why listening matters. Sometimes the smallest word can turn a bridge into a wall. Her influence was undeniable now. What had begun as a chance encounter in a boardroom had become a career built on trust and skill. Li Wei often reminded her, "You didn't stumble into this. You prepared for it." Amara's journey is built in direct contrast to Caldwell's downfall. While she, strengthened by every hour of study and every challenge overcome, begins to flourish, he sinks into ruin. Once a synonym for success and influence, Caldwell is now looked upon with disdain or pity. Investors avoid him, journalists no longer seek him, and former allies drift away. He wanders the city like a well-dressed ghost, clinging to an identity the world has already discarded. One night, the two cross paths by chance in a restaurant. Amara is surrounded by colleagues, laughing naturally, without ostentation, but radiating genuine respect. Caldwell watches her with bitterness, but when their eyes meet, he realizes something devastating. There is no fear, no shame in her gaze, only the calm of someone who sees a man destroyed by his own arrogance. Unable to hold her stare, he turns away, wounded by this silent verdict. Meanwhile, Amara continues to receive Madame Zhang's teachings, who reminds her that true power does not lie in the volume of one's voice, but in the depth of the echo one's words leave behind. Embracing this wisdom, Amara learns to assert herself without aggression, allowing her work to speak for itself until the world around her adjusts to her presence. At a dinner with advisors, Li Wei proposes a conversation about legacy. While others speak of wealth or innovation, Amara expresses her simple yet powerful desire to leave behind rooms where no one feels invisible. The respectful silence and the pride in Li Wei's eyes confirm that she has found her purpose. This purpose is tested at a forum on responsible expansion. The event, seemingly trivial, reveals itself as Caldwell's attempt to stage a public comeback, disguising ambition behind speeches of superficial remorse. Amara prepares not to confront him directly, but to maintain balance and prevent the meeting from devolving into hostility. On stage, Caldwell delivers his narrative of victimhood. He speaks of misunderstandings and unintended consequences, scattering blame in all directions. He tries to paint his story as that of a visionary who stumbled, but the audience is no longer deceived. The weight of suspicious silence is heavier than any jeer. When he insinuates that a former employee used him as a stepping stone, a clear allusion to Amara, the atmosphere tightens. She does not seek the microphone, but another panelist invites her to share her view on responsibility. Calmly, Amara defines, responsibility is not discourse, but action visible to those who do not benefit from it. A true apology lies in practical changes, corrected policies, transformed habits, remembered names. She then offers concrete examples for the next business day. Budgets for interpreters, seating based on contribution rather than hierarchy, leaders shadowing invisible roles quarterly. For the first time that day, the audience takes notes intently. Caldwell reacts with fury, calling her ideas naive and defending the logic of war in business. Li Wei counters serenely. Sustainable businesses feed families, while wars produce orphans. He announces that his company will immediately adopt Amara's proposals, not as a marketing strategy, but as a practice of integrity. The room does not erupt in applause, but transforms into a silence heavy with conviction. After the event, Caldwell privately confronts Amara. He accuses her of ruining him and vows revenge. Amara, firm but without hatred, replies that she does not need his name as a brick to build her spaces. Her work is to create rooms where people can breathe. He insists that men like him don't disappear, to which she replies, "Power disappears when it ceases to serve others." The phrase strikes him like a blow, and he recoils even if he will not admit defeat. Guided by Madame Zhang not to waste victory on empty celebrations, Amara begins drafting what she calls the Bridge Room Playbook, a practical guide to replace performance with genuine practice. Li Wei funds its publication, making it an open resource. The project's pilot in a mid-sized company brings concrete results: reduced turnover, renewed partnerships, and recognition of previously invisible talent. Meanwhile, Caldwell attempts to relaunch his image with aggressive speeches on tough leadership, but investors reject him. Ironically, one of these materials reaches Amara, who is invited to teach the fundamentals of sustainable leadership to new founders. Without ever mentioning Caldwell, she delivers lessons on how not to destroy the people who make success possible. With Li Wei's support, the playbook expands into micro-scholarships for invisible workers, training them as cultural mediators. The project is given a name inspired by Amara's original desire: rooms where no one's invisible. The launch takes place without glamour. In a simple community center, with folding chairs and the smell of coffee and cardamom. Executives, cooks, janitors, translators, and receptionists sit side by side, with no reserved places. Amara tells her story without spectacle, teaching practices of listening, respect, and building intercultural bridges. The environment becomes a quiet revolution, made of shared pens, cross conversations, and unexpected learning across distant professions. In this context, Caldwell discreetly reappears. He watches for a few minutes, hesitant, and finally approaches. For the first time, he admits he was wrong, not as a redemptive gesture, but as raw acknowledgement. He hands over an envelope, not as charity, but as rent for the rooms he once diminished. Amara directs him to begin by listening to those he ignored when he held power. He accepts, transformed by a silence that forces him to abandon old scripts. The donated funds finance translations of the playbook into more languages. Its impact grows in small waves. Scholarships distributed, hospitals hiring cultural mediators, meetings changing tone in companies. Amara moves forward, steady in her mission. In the end, she writes in her notebook, beneath the old phrase about character, a new one: tomorrow I will place more chairs. It is the synthesis of her journey, not to seek glory, but to open space. Meanwhile, as Li Wei reviews reports, he realizes that true business lies precisely in these invisible transformations. And, in ordinary rooms across the world, simple rituals of listening and respect begin to change the temperature of relationships. Without fireworks or grand finales, the story concludes with doors opening softly, bridges built through daily life, and the promise of spaces where no one needs to be invisible in order to be seen.